So if half of the growth, or 40% of the growth, or 60% of the growth that one experiences in our lifetime has come from demographic growth, and that goes away, the economic growth goes down quite a bit automatically. Economic growth slows. How's it go? Slow economic growth, increased capital income ratio, increased inequality, almost inevitably. Not almost inevitably, probably inevitably. What about the other factor, technological growth? That will save us, right? Well, maybe. Let's go ahead. 1.5% economic growth at the second half of the 21st century is Piketty's, the number he accepts. He prefers 1.2 himself. Others would say 0.5. But this is what they figured to be best guesstimates of economic growth the second half of the 21st century. Almost all of it from technological growth. You say, well, where do you come from a number like that? I mean, how can you even project? And the concept here is something that he calls the technological frontier. And his argument, and he justifies it in chapter after chapter, lots of research, more than a bunch of high school teachers or doctors could justify, could make a judgment about. But where he says this probably somewhere around 1.5, 1.2 is about as fast as an economy could possibly grow once that society hits the advanced stages of technology in the world. Like we are, like Europe is, like Japan is, like China's getting to very quickly. That's about the limit. Pretty good, really, but not compared to the 4% economic growth that some of us lived through when we were young. And what he will then say is, now, between now and 2050, it'll be faster than 1.5 for sure, because we still got a lot of catch-up phases going on. These are societies that aren't at the advanced stages of technology, like us and like Europe and so forth. And those societies that aren't catch up. And as they catch up, they grow faster because they copy. And they work harder and so forth. Like we did after the War of 1812 and caught Europe. Or like Japan did in the Meiji period in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. They grow incredibly fast, but only for about a generation. Then they reach the technological frontier too. Like France and Germany did after World War II, catching back up to us after the devastation, like China is now. It typically lasts about a generation. In China's case, it's so big, maybe it's more like 40 years, but then it's over. And then those societies get to the technological frontier, and they keep growing, but they don't grow that much faster because they've caught up. They've caught up. Of course, Piketty goes on to say, now, it may be that 1.5 is incredibly optimistic. The two things, in his opinion, could derail it, seriously derail it. One, the failure to convert to a clean economy, a clean energy economy. And two, the threat of serious violence, political violence, in those parts of the world which are so far behind. Well, all we got to do is open the newspaper and say, yeah, maybe this puts a different light on what's going on. In any case, his argument is that, to repeat, the number one take-home lesson, not necessarily number one in his priorities, but the first take-home lesson from his is the economic growth is slowing inevitably in the 21st century, and especially the second half of the 21st century. That's really daunting because it creates slower growth, higher capital income ratio, more inequality, almost automatically. And inequality, people that are feeling unequal and unhappy about that just don't sit around and seethe. They act. Sometimes chaotically, but eventually in organized ideological fashion, like communism or a caliphate or whatever. You just don't die because the world has passed you by. The last graphic sort of sums this up. This is Piketty's projection of capital income ratio out to the year 2100. Here we are in the world leading up to World War I, not Europe, but the world leading up to World War I. Enormous drop in capital income ratio, but now starting around the 1970 period particularly, growing. And his projection is probably about 700% capital income ratio for the whole planet by the end of the century. Well, that was what the capital income ratio was for Europe as World War I opens. And there are social consequences of that, serious social consequences. All right, that sounds really awful. Here's the good point from Piketty's. This is point number 2. Solutions exist. Remedies are there. Many have already been used, probably have to be rethought, maybe some discarded. But and new ones surely are available if we are thoughtful about the issues that are before the human beings living in the second half of the 21st century. Piketty says stuff like this all the time in chapter after chapter. The history of the distribution of wealth has always been deeply political. It is not automatic economic stuff, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's plenty we can do about it. And so he's going to, this next 10 minutes is going to go through the laundry list of what can and can't be done about it. One thing that was tried at the beginning of the last century was to say, no problem with the rising capital income ratio. We'll just turn all that capital from private to public. We'll nationalize it. Let's call it communism. That Russia tries after World War I. And of course, we can say, as Piketty does, Piketty himself says, you know, I'm not in that camp. I mean, I turned 18 when the Berlin Wall comes down. Piketty said, my generation was vaccinated for life with praising communism and bashing capitalism. We're not going there. We lived that when we were young. Nonetheless, there's a reason why the Soviets did try that. What else do you do when you've got a corrupt imperial Russian system supported by loans from France and the rest of the European world, and you're living in no dignity, with no dignity whatsoever? You're looking for a solution. It doesn't sound so completely crazy when nothing else seems to work. So they tried it. And if we're for a little bit, take a little bit of sidestep on as far as history goes, to some degree we should be thankful they did. Because Joseph Stalin was able to produce an economic growth that was good enough to stop Hitler. We didn't do it. I mean, the Battle of Stalingrad, the winner of 42, the winner of 43, that stops Hitler. And yes, there's a lot of good stuff that we did, but it was the Soviet Union that took the brunt of that darn thing, and it wouldn't have happened without this incredible economic. But yeah, no, I should have never said that. My wife is gonna. I'm gonna catch it when I get home. Yeah, I'm already catching it. But Selenbacher liked it. That aside, it didn't work. And Piketty says it didn't work. So we go to the Berlin Wall. Yeah, it didn't work. A full nationalization of capital doesn't work. At least it seems it doesn't work historically. You got to leave a lot of that capital in private hands. That makes sense. You get entrepreneurship, creativity. Piketty's all for that. But he does want to say you need to be a little careful. So this is, if we can go to the Piketty here, a little bit about his biography. I mean, here's a guy who, yes, at 18, the Berlin Wall came down. He and his colleagues are inoculated for life about bashing capitalism and praising communism. But by the same token, at 22 years, he's earned his PhD at 22 years old. That alone is fairly impressive. He gets hired, in his vocabulary, by a university near Boston. Rather cheeky. It wasn't Harvard, it was MIT. But at 22 years old, there he is, doing brilliant economics like the rest of them, and he was utterly unfulfilled. Said it was brilliant stuff, but all this mathematical, he called it childish mathematics. It wasn't childish in terms of mathematical ability, but devoted to theoretical stuff that wasn't connected to real life. He pulled up stakes and went back to France and said, I want to devote my life to redoing work from a guy who I learned about at MIT, a guy named Simon Kuznets, who did really impressive data on wealth and income. And that's this book is sort of a result of that. And in the introduction of his book, he said, let me set up a contrast of points of view. And he said, not yet. He said, you know, if we go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, there were these classical economists that saw things turning out with apocalyptic disasters. Malthus and Ricardo, and above all, Karl Marx said it's not going to end well. And Piketty will say, while they got pretty much every detail wrong about how it would not end well, their intuition that there was heck to pay down the road turned out to be fairly right. World War I, the Depression, World War II. So now contrast that with his hero, a guy he really admires, this Simon Kuznets, who he lionizes because the guy does such great detailed work on wealth and inequality in the United States from 1913. His work is from 1913 to 1948 because that's when Kuznets was living. And he does this great amount of data, and of course, one of the things Piketty asked at MIT is, well, where's the follow-up on this work? And these guys say, well, we haven't done any of that. We're doing mathematical formulas. He said, I'm going to go home and do some follow-up on this stuff. What he dislikes about the legacy of Kuznets was he becomes famous for what's called the Kuznets curve, in which he argues, made sense for the data he had, that yes, in the early stages of industrialization, inequality does get worse. There is exploitation. But in the more advanced stages, it gets better. And workers have more skills and they get a better share of the income. So you get this nice bell-shaped curve and it gets better. And the capitalism becomes more benevolent in the advanced stages, which the United States is in. And it's we would also sort of know this by the phrase, rising tide lifts all boats, or stuff like that. And Piketty says, well, let's see. I'm going to go home for 20 years and collect data and see. So he's got this current contrast between these guys that see devastation and workers being exploited and heck to pay down the road versus Kuznets, who sort of gives rise to this benevolent view that it's all going to work out on its own without any interference. So go ahead, John. Here, it's too complicated. I mean, let's just focus on the capital income ratio line. All the rest of it is very interesting, but we don't have time. Here's the capital income ratio in France. We picked France because it's Piketty's country. But you got pretty much the same graph for Britain and for Germany and somewhat similar for the United States. 1,700 horrendous inequalities, 700% capital income ratio. And then it collapses, just as Kuznets said it did. So Kuznets is right? Well, Piketty says, well, wait a minute. Two things. One, the collapse didn't stay. Capital income ratio is growing again. And two, it didn't collapse because of benevolent capitalism. It collapsed because of war. The horrid destructions of war and the Depression and World War II. He wants everyone that's going to discuss this to start with that understanding. It was war that reset capital income ratio in Europe and the United States and gave us a second chance to start and not have so much inequality. So I guess we go through that, don't we? Yeah. I mean, it was war. It was a devastating... World War I, and let's see, remind me, when did World War I start? Yeah, isn't that about 100 years ago? I don't know if the publication of this book is time for that or not, but it seems interesting. It's World War I that rips the heart out of Europe, and Europe has really, in some ways, never really recovered. It certainly never recovered its leadership in the world. And World War I leads directly in, because the lessons are not learned, and so the kind of rather excesses of capitalism that were already in vogue come right back in the 1920s, and the result of that, of course, is the next catastrophe. Go ahead, John. And we have a depression, which is devastating for all of Europe, and Japan included, and certainly the United States. Go ahead. And horribly, the depression in Germany leads directly to Nazism and Hitler. There's not going to be any Nazism and Hitler with no depression, but within 3 years of the depression, Hitler is elected. He's not in that picture. You got Hitler, and then of course it's just wrenching. I find myself standing here on the stage almost tearing up. I mean, the horrendous, awful, unspeakable horrors of World War II, both in Europe and in Asia, for that matter. So go ahead. It is war, Piketty wants to point out, that gets rid of this horrendously high capital income ratio, not the benevolent forces of the market.